Okay. I now give it back to you, Chris Bat-Savage and Mike Lisi.
Thanks, Tony. Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the joint meeting with the ASMFC Bluefish Management Board and the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council. My name is Chris Bat-Savage. I am the board chair from North Carolina, the administrative proxy. With me co-chairing today is Mike Luisi, Mid-Atlantic Council chair. Before I start going through the agenda, just go through the normal housekeeping items for joint meetings. Since we're operating as a joint body, any motions that are made today, I'm not sure if there will be any, we'll need motions from both the board and the council in order to debate the motion, and both will need to pass by both the board and council for it to move forward. What we also do, again, if we have motions today, is we'll alternate between which body goes first in terms of voting, just to kind of balance things out. And as always, the board will be given time to caucus, and each state should have a designated commissioner to cast a vote for their state. Mike, is there any introductory comments you want to add, or things that I forgot before we get moving through the agenda?
No, I think you covered it, Chris. Again, my name is Mike Luisi. I'll be co-chairing today with Chris, and then later on with Adam Nowalski when we switch boards. No, Chris, I think you got it all. I just want to welcome everybody, and I look forward to the discussion today. Thanks. All you, Chris.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so we'll move on to the approval of the agenda. Has everyone got a chance to look at that? Are there any changes to the agenda or additions to the agenda that anyone would like to make?
I don't see any hands. Hold on, let me just double check. I don't see any hands raised.
All right, thanks. So we'll consider that approved. Next is approval of the proceedings from the May 2020 meeting. Are there any changes, modifications, et cetera, to the proceedings?
I do not see any hands raised.
Okay, then we'll consider those approved. Next is public comment. This is an opportunity for the public to provide any comments on items that are not on the agenda. I'll pause here to see if any public would like to provide any comment at this time.
And as a reminder to raise your hand, you just push on that hand button for the public. And I don't see any hands.
All right, thanks, Danny. All right, so moving on, next item is a review of the Fishery Management Action Team discussion document on Bluefish allocation and rebuilding draft amendment. Dustin Colson-Leaning from the Commission and Matt Seeley from the Council will be presenting that information today. So Dustin and Matt, it's all yours.
Good morning, this is Matt. I just making sure I get my screen and everything shown appropriately. Mr. Chairman, do you see the full screen presentation there?
Yes, I do, Matt, thanks.
And you can hear me okay? I've been having some audio issues with my phone, and if that does happen, please interrupt me as soon as you can tell, and I can backtrack.
You're coming in loud and clear on my end.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, good morning, everyone. I know Dustin and myself were excited to talk to you about the Atlantic Bluefish Amendment here and the progress that the Fishery Management Action Team has been making. I'm going to start the presentation and go through the first 5 issues, and then Dustin is going to take control after and go through the remaining issues within the amendment. And then we'll conclude with some next steps, and then we'll take any questions that you have. So thank you. So here's a snapshot reminder of the timeline that this amendment is on. While not a complete timeline, this shows some of the big steps taken thus far in blue, followed by upcoming big steps in the amendment process in green. And the 2019 operational assessment indicated that the stock was overfished, and NOAA Fisheries released the overfish designation in November of 2019. This began the 2-year timeline for when a rebuilding plan must be implemented. And the goal is to have final action in the spring of 2021 so that the rebuilding plan can be implemented by the spring of 2022. As of now, we have 10 amendment issues that are being addressed through this action. For the purpose of this meeting and ensuring that FMAT receives all the information they need, we'll only be discussing the underlined issues. However, if you do have comments or concerns or any issues that we're on any issues that we're not discussing today, we're happy to address those comments via email. And then again, all 10 issues will be discussed at the joint December meeting. And for each issue we present, we'll provide some background tables and then the FMAT recommendations and questions for the council and board. So starting with issue 2, the sector allocations. Under the current fishery management plan for bluefish, the acceptable biological catch equals the fishery level annual catch limit, which is then divided into a commercial and recreational annual catch target based on the allocation percentages that are defined in the FMP. And the percentages are currently 83% recreational and 17% commercial. Sector-specific expected discards are subtracted from the sector-specific ACTs to derive a commercial quota and recreational harvest limit. And aside from the status quo option, the following approaches revise the allocation percentages based on modified base years or different data sets. So as background, we have 2 sets of sector allocation alternatives, both using 4 different time series, plus the status quo alternative. The top alternative set is based on catch data using the MRIP discards, while the bottom alternative set is based on landings data. And as you can see, some of the time series result in the same exact allocation percentages. So we hope to soon slim down the alternative sets at the joint meeting in December. For this presentation, we wanted to focus on the recommendations related to phasing in allocation changes and implementing a trigger approach. So currently both sectors are greatly impacted by a reduced quota due to the overfish designation, and since recreational to commercial sector transfers have been set to 0. Furthermore, the alternatives currently in development for this amendment decrease the commercial allocation. To deal with these lower quotas, phasing in the allocation changes allows for commercial and recreational allocation percentages to transition slowly over time, which we're hoping has the potential to reduce some economic burden. And when considering the potential to phase in allocations, the FMAT recommends streamlining a phase-in timeline with the rebuilding timeline, and noted that changing allocations on a continual basis during a rebuilding plan may unnecessarily overcomplicate management. The FMAT also discussed what an appropriate trigger threshold level would be once the quotas increase post-rebuilding plan. FMAT is concerned about the trade-off between the perceived benefit and added complexity, and ultimately noted that a trigger approach is most likely not an appropriate management tool during rebuilding. Considering a post-rebuilding bluefish world, the FMAT has tried to answer the question, what is an appropriate trigger threshold level? And the main considerations are that recent biomass levels have remained low, so using an average ABC approach may not be appropriate. The FMAT also noted that the reallocation scheme above a trigger threshold seems to be more of a policy decision, and the FMAT was unsure of how to reallocate. So we'll have these summary tables at the end of each issue that we discuss. To summarize the approaches being discussed within the sector allocations, the FMAT recommends keeping the phase-in approach for further development, and that the selected duration to phase-in allocations should be streamlined with the preferred rebuilding plan. For the trigger approach, the FMAT recommends this be removed from further consideration in the amendment, but the FMAT would like to see a provision included that would allow future implementation via a framework. Issue 3 is the commercial allocations to the states. There are 3 topics we need to discuss under this issue: a phase-in approach and a trigger approach, which we just discussed under sector allocations, and minimum default allocations. As background, this table represents the 6 different allocation alternatives using landings data. And unlike the sector allocations, many of these alternatives differ significantly from each other. So, pay close attention to the specific time series and the percentages that are evident there. And again, happy to come back to any of these slides at any time. The first topic under issue 3 is again the phase-in approach, and the FMAT noted that the same comments under the sector allocations apply here for the commercial allocations to the states. Again, the commercial sector is greatly impacted by a reduced quota, and to deal with these lower quotas, phasing in allocation changes allows for commercial state allocation percentages to transition slowly over time, again, hopefully with the potential to reduce some economic burden. And the FMAT recommends streamlining a phase-in timeline with the rebuilding timeline, and noted that changing allocations on a continual basis, again, may overcomplicate management. The second topic under issue 3 is again the trigger approach. Here we're presenting the baseline or status quo Bluefish state allocations under a 20-year, 10-year, and 5-year average commercial quota as the trigger point. Staff proposed 3 options to the FMAT with how additional commercial quota above a trigger could be allocated to the states. Under these examples, states with currently less than 1% of the coastwide quota would receive either 0.05%, 0.1%, or 0.25% of the additional quota. And then other states would evenly split the remaining allocation. And so those are those 3 columns that you see there, option 1, 2, and 3, using that the different allocation percentages that can be split up based on the baseline quotas. So some of the FMAT comments that applied, the same comments under the sector allocations apply here for the commercial allocations to the states. The discussion surrounding an appropriate trigger threshold level led to the FMAT's concern about the trade-off between the perceived benefit and added complexity. However, the main considerations in trying to develop an appropriate trigger seem to be more of a policy decision, especially since recent biomass levels have remained low, and using an average ABC approach may not be appropriate. Therefore, the FMAT was unsure of how to reallocate in order to refine the equity across states. Overall, the FMAT does recommend further development of this approach. So to deal with some of the equity issues we're talking about, the FMAT recommended staff develop a range of baseline quotas and the associated additional quota allocations. The justification behind this was because states with a very small baseline allocation should not receive the same amount of additional quota as states that have a very large baseline quota. So under this example, the FMAT proposed that if a state's baseline quota was 0 to 1%, they would receive 0.25% of the additional quota. From 1 to 5%, a state would receive 3% of the additional quota. And finally, a baseline quota greater than 5% would result in 12.86% of the additional quota, which is the remainder of the allocation split evenly amongst states. And to summarize, the FMAT recommends further development of the trigger approach for the commercial allocations to the states. Now, the third topic under issue 3 is the ability to implement minimum default allocations. This was developed by the FMAT as a result of a recommendation from a board member at the last joint meeting. To develop these alternatives, the FMAT modeled the approach off Amendment 3 for Atlantic Menhaden. These alternatives apply a fixed minimum quota, and the FMAT used a range of percentages from 0.1 to 1%. And then the remainder of the total allowable landings is allocated based on average landings using the time series selected by the council and board for this amendment. So provided here is an example of minimum default allocations using 0.1%. And all of the other alternatives are within the FMAT summary as part of your briefing materials, so the different ranges of percentages I was referring to. So towards the left of the table, you see the true status quo allocations. These are the current allocations that are existing in the FMP with no minimum default allocation included. Then you see the status quo alternative, but with a minimum default allocation of 0.1% applied. And this is why the percentages are different. And then the remaining columns all also apply the same 0.1% to each proposed time series. And ultimately, the FMAT recommends this remain in the amendment for further development. To summarize the approaches being discussed within the commercial allocations to the states, the FMAT recommends the phase-in approach be kept for further development and streamlined with a preferred rebuilding timeline. The trigger approach should also be kept for further development, but with refined equity across states. This is between, staff has been going back and forth with the FMAT. The next FMAT meeting, it'll be further developed. That way we can have more detailed examples for you at the subsequent meeting. And for minimum default allocations, the FMAT noted that the current alternatives include a sufficient range of percentages and should be kept for further development. The FMAT also reviewed the proposal made by the state of Florida to implement regional-based allocations. This is now issue 4. The proposal pools quota between states that occupy the same region, and the proposal stipulates that commercial trip limits could be used to ensure that all states have access to the resource. The allocation percentages in the table also use the same time series that were presented for the other allocation-related issues in the amendment. So the regionalization follows the initial logical geographic approach. We have New England, Mid-Atlantic, South Atlantic. The FMAT then noted that this could create a race-to-fish situation within a given region that could cause states to not hold as much interest in this approach. The FMAT then commented that the proposed geographic regions have no biological basis, so the FMAT is interested in identifying if there is a biological basis, and noted that if there's not, the regional approach may have less technical merit and should be removed from further development. The FMAT further commented that the regional commercial allocations and the associated trip limits would require a high level of state cooperation and buy-in. And there's also concern that the regulations regarding commercial trip limits and transfers may be challenging to coordinate across states in each region. And finally, the FMAT noted there would be a loss of autonomy and flexibility to manage fisheries at the state level. So to help develop appropriate trip limits for a given region, the FMAT looked at the amount of trips landing quota in specific pound bins. As you can see in New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the South Atlantic, more than 94% of all trips in each year landed less than 500 pounds. Using the trends present in the top table and the current state commercial trip limits, staff developed the proposed trip limits in the bottom table for FMAT discussion. Upon FMAT review, the group recommended staff redevelop the top table to display each trip limit bin's percent contribution to the total landings for that year, instead of as a percentage of trips. And this will help identify if the majority of bluefish landings are coming from a small number of trips with very high landings, or many trips with a low amount of landings. Furthermore, the FMAT recommended reassessment of the proposed trip limits once the landings data have been analyzed. Alternatively to the regional commercial allocation approach, we wanted to emphasize that there are provisions in the current regulations for states to combine quotas should they be interested. Any state may do so outside of this amendment on a voluntary case-by-case basis. The FMAT confirmed with GARFO that this regulatory language may still be applied. So states that want to combine quotas will need to write a joint letter to the regional administrator. And once approved, the 2 or more states' joint quota will be monitored as a combined entity. So there are technically provisions currently in place that allow for these combined quotas. So now to summarize the regional commercial allocations, the FMAT noted that they will evaluate whether the regional approach has biological basis. Lacking biological backing, the FMAT would recommend removal, especially considering regional allocations will lead to a loss of autonomy and reduced flexibility for states to manage their own fisheries. And the Bluefish advisors were mainly in support of further exploring regional allocations, again, pending the associated management measures. In considering trip limit step-downs, the FMAT recommended staff refine the trip limit analysis to identify if most bluefish landings are coming from a small number of trips with very high landings or many trips with a low amount of landings. Then we're going to reassess the proposed trip limits and come back to you with more information here at the next meeting. Transitioning to issue 5, the rebuilding plan. The Fishery Management Action Team wanted to again emphasize that adjustments to the Council's risk policy are necessary under alternatives 5.3, 4, and 5. This is the only way that the council and board can consider a rebuilding plan longer than 5 years and allow the higher associated catches. The FMAT also discussed the concerns raised by the council and board at the last meeting in regards to the cyclical nature of bluefish abundance and the influence that forage fish and the environment have on the species' ability to rebuild biomass to the target within the specified timeline. The FMAT recognizes these concerns and the role that the calibrated MRIP estimates have had on the stock assessment. However, there was consensus that we need to wait and at least see how the rebuilding plan initially performs. The FMAT noted if the rebuilding plan is found to be making inadequate progress, adjustments can be made to the plan that include more restrictive management measures and potentially increased funding for research to understand why a rebuilding plan is not going as initially proposed. But ultimately, NOAA Fisheries has specific qualification criteria to assess if adequate rebuilding progress has been made. And there was consensus among the FMAT that it's important to first address fishing mortality and then reassess. As more data becomes available and stock assessment updates are conducted, the biological reference points may change and shift stakeholder perspective on the rebuilding process. But overall, this rebuilding plan should be thought of as a living plan, as it's regularly reviewed and revised when necessary. So you've seen this figure before. Magnuson-Stevens Act requires that a rebuilding plan be submitted to NOAA Fisheries by the end of September 2021. This will allow for implementation during the 2022 fishing year. Here we're presenting catch on the left and biomass on the right for each rebuilding projection. Each color corresponds to a different rebuilding plan, and the colors are consistent on both figures. As you can see on the catch figure to the left, each rebuilding projection has different sets of catch over the rebuilding duration. On the biomass figure to the right, all projections reach the spawning stock biomass MSY target of about 200,000 metric tons by 2031, which is within our 10-year timeline. And upon review during the advisory panel meeting, most bluefish advisors commented that they prefer a longer rebuilding timeline to encourage higher catches and stability within the fisheries. So in summary, there are 5 rebuilding projections to be considered, with an understanding that the constant fishing mortality or constant harvest scenarios will be updated next year when a new assessment is available. This will include how long it will take to rebuild under an updated constant fishing mortality or constant harvest scenario, and should stay within the proposed durations. So I'm going to transfer things over to Dustin now. Okay.
All right, just getting this set up here.
Looks good, Dustin.
Matt, can you see the? Okay, perfect. And you can hear me okay?
You sound great.
Same thing goes for me as well. If my audio starts breaking up, please do let me know. So I'll be covering issue 6, which addresses for-hire sector separation. As we have discussed before, there are 3 different potential structures for division of for-hire versus private allocation, not including the status quo alternative. This would take place at the ACL level, the sub-ACL level, and the RHL level. The allocation structures have different implications for accountability and the development of allocation percentages, and I will go over the pros and cons in the coming slides. Displayed here are status quo in the upper left and the 3 different flowchart structures for how the sector separation could occur. Option A is the current structure in the Bluefish FMP. Option B would require the development of commercial and recreational and for-hire allocation alternatives. Option C would maintain allocation between the commercial and recreational sectors, but then the recreational ACLs would be allocated between the private and for-hire sectors. And then option D would split the RHL into 2 separate RHLs for the private and for-hire sectors. So the FMAT recommends removal of structure B. The FMAT was concerned that this structure would require starting from scratch in terms of developing allocations between all three sectors, when we have already developed alternatives that allocate between just two sectors, the commercial and recreational fisheries. The FMAT also recommends removal of structure D, which includes separate management of harvest only, and accountability is problematic under this structure. The FMAT recommends development of structure C, where accountability measures are applied at the sub-ACL level, and this option represents a true sector separation. I've prepared a scenario to demonstrate why accountability is problematic under structure D, and hopefully this will shed some light on just the sector separation process in general. You'll notice that I have removed the commercial sector portion here to simplify this example. And so in this example, the recreational ACL is set at 18 million pounds under both structures, as noted in the bolded text. In structure C, the two sectors are allocated their own sub-ACLs, and the private angler sector receives 12 million pounds, and the for-hire sector receives 6 million pounds. Each sector's sub-ACL are reduced slightly to account for discards. And so this results in the private angler sector RHL equaling 10 million pounds and the for-hire sector RHL equaling 5 million pounds. In structure D on the right, the recreational RHL is reduced to 15 million pounds to account for discards, and then the RHL is split. The private angler sector is allocated 10 million pounds, and the for-hire sector is allocated 5 million pounds. You'll notice that the resulting RHLs under both structures are the same. So let's say in this example that the private angler sector lands 10 million pounds. The corresponding RHLs under each structure are shaded in green to represent that this sector harvested within its landing limit. Additionally, the private sector discarded 2 million fish. The private angler sub-ACL is then highlighted in green under structure C to demonstrate that the sub-ACL was not exceeded. Taking this example further, let's say that the for-hire sector also stays within its landings limit for the year by harvesting 5 million pounds of fish. So far, so good under each structure. Unfortunately, in this example, let's just say that the for-hire sector also had higher than projected level of discards with 2 million pounds of discards. On the left, we can see that the for-hire sub-ACL has been exceeded, as displayed in red. On the right, under structure D, we see that the recreational ACL was exceeded when you add up both sectors, landings and discards. Under structure C, accountability measures in the form of a pound-for-pound payback would be applied to only the for-hire sector due to its overage. The problem with sector separation structure D becomes clear when you look at the right. Because the recreational ACL was exceeded, this affects both sectors in the form of a pound-for-pound payback, even though the private recreational sector harvested within its landings limits. Under structure D, both sectors are held accountable to the other sector's discards. So the different allocation alternatives are displayed here using both landings and catch data. And if for-hire sector separation occurs at the sub-ACL level, which would be structure C, the FMAT recommends using catch data to develop allocation percentages. So during scoping, we received many comments from the public about using VTR data for management. However, the FMAT did not develop allocation alternatives using VTR data thus far because most states do not require catch reporting from for-hire vessels operating within state waters. During the most recent monitoring/technical committee meeting, we polled the different members and we found that only a handful of states actually require 100% coverage in data reporting. The FMAT also recommends utilizing MRIP data for accountability at first in catch accounting. MRIP data could be replaced by VTR for accounting once states have implemented the proper reporting requirements. Despite the FMAT's preference for using MRIP for accountability, they had concerns about the reliability of MRIP data at the mode level. mainly the high PSE values. As a reminder, the FMAT previously recommended removing sector separation from this amendment prior to the June meeting, citing these same concerns. This graph just shows even further why it may not be a great idea to use VTR data to develop allocations. This graph displays the large disparity in MRIP estimates to VTR data. And if we used VTR data, the for-hire sector would get a much smaller allocation, most likely because not all of the for-hire vessels are reporting. So when presented this information during the AP's fishery performance review, the AP provided some mixed feedback regarding sector separation. One advisor spoke in support of using MRIP data to develop allocations, since not all for-hire vessels submit VTRs. The AP member in support of using VTR data said that if people do not submit VTRs, they should not be part of the for-hire allocation. And that same AP member also thought that there should be a committee of for-hire members to help inform management with setting recreational measures such as size, season, and bag limit. Another AP member spoke in opposition to for-hire sector separation, saying that the difference in bag limits for bluefish are not fair anymore. If the for-hire sector separation must happen, there needs to be a good look at what a fair allocation would be. So this table presents a summary of FMAT recommendations and considerations. The FMAT is recommending that sector separation flowchart structures B and D be removed and C be kept in for further development. Additionally, relying on VTRs and ensuring all states implement the same requirements in a timely manner is a large undertaking, which will require significant administrative effort and stakeholder buy-in. Developing 100% reporting may also be necessary prior to implementing for-hire sector separation. So moving on to issue 7, which covers the sector transfers. The FMAT has refined the alternatives and the sector transfer process, but still has some areas that we're asking for input from the boarding council. As is done under the current sector transfer process, the need for a transfer would be addressed annually through specifications. Prior to the August meeting, the monitoring committee would develop a projection of next year's catch or landings for both the recreational and commercial sectors, using considerations such as catch in prior years. Changes in management measures such as bag limits and quotas, trends in fishery effort, and changes in abundance and biomass levels. The need for a transfer would be identified through the projections process, and the table identifies scenarios when a transfer would or would not occur. So under the existing sector transfer process, specifications are implemented in January for the new fishing year, and NOAA Fisheries later reassesses the transfer amount in February based on new data, mainly MRIP's preliminary data for the prior year, and an adjustment notice is released in March or April. The FMAT did not think this post-specifications adjustment could be made if quota is transferred from the commercial fishery to the recreational fishery, namely because recreational measures are set in December based off of an RHL that is determined in August. To revisit this RHL in March of the next year would upend this process and really throw the recreational measure setting process into territory which would potentially be dangerous and cause more overages. That being said, without adjustments, projections are based off of incomplete data during the prior year in August. In the case of the recreational fishery, only Wave 2 data is available by the August meeting, and this uncertainty in the projections does increase the risk of overages. The transition from old uncalibrated MRIP data to new calibrated MRIP data in recent years does add uncertainty in analyzing past performance relative to catch and landings limits, and calls into question whether any analyses can actually inform the size of the transfer cap that may be needed in future years. As you may recall, the current process sets a 10.5 million pound cap, but the FMAT settled on a 5 to 15% cap, looking at 5 to 15% of the ABC, and thought this would be a reasonable range of alternatives to present for the draft amendment. While this prevents any major one-year swings in allocation, the cap does scale with biomass, which the FMAT thought was more appropriate than the fixed 10.5 million pounds that is currently in the FMP. The FMAT also discussed criteria for prohibiting a transfer and came up with a few options. Transfers could be prohibited when the stock is overfished, overfishing is occurring, or when the stock is rebuilding. And the FMAT is seeking feedback from the board and council on the appropriateness of these criteria. Lastly, sector transfers become quite complicated if for-hire sector separation is implemented. And the FMAT discussed several options under this sector separation scenario. So option one is that the transfers between the sectors are prohibited. And the main idea behind this is that any new regulatory structure involved with developing recreational sector separation would create additional complexity in developing the transfer provision. Transfers also have the potential to increase the probability of ABC overages, especially considering the greater uncertainty in breaking down recreational data by mode. Option two would be the tri-directional transfer approach, where transfers can occur between all three sectors. So the big proponents for this method would be equity and flexibility. However, there are numerous reasons against using this option. This option, firstly, greatly complicates the specifications process with the need to address additional considerations, such as which directions transfers should occur and how much should be allocated to each sector. Those are decisions that would become quite contentious and very challenging for the monitoring committee to analyze. The FMAT also put forward option three as a potential alternative. Option three assumes that the recreational sector separation occurs at the sub-ACL level, and landings are projected for the for-hire sector, private angler sector, and the commercial sector individually and compared to their respective landings limits. If the transfer is from the recreational sector to the commercial sector, any projected underage is deducted from the respective sector's landings limits and then added to the commercial quota. ACLs would be updated accordingly if the transfer is from the commercial sector to the recreational sector. The transfer quota is then allocated between the private angler and for-hire sectors based on a predefined allocation percentages that would be determined in this amendment. It's also important to note here that the FMAT had concerns about utilizing MRIP data in this way. Projecting recreational landings has already proven to be a challenge through the current process, and there is not an insignificant degree of uncertainty in projecting landings by mode when recreational measures are changing year to year, which seems to be a territory we might be moving into now that we have a very restrictive bag limit. So the AP had some concerns about this whole process as well. One AP member said that the MRIP estimates may cause problems for transfers due to the timing of when data is released, and the consistent delay is going to affect the recreational projections. Conversely, commercial data is a census and not an estimate, and he thought it was better suited for informing the transfer process as it currently exists. In summary, we are looking for board and council feedback on the criteria for prohibiting a transfer and the several options for transfers discussed thus far. Any discussion on reservations about these methods or potential ways forward would be very helpful. Issue 8, and this is the last issue we'll cover, covers the commercial state-to-state transfers. The status quo is that any state implementing a state commercial quota for bluefish may request approval from the regional administrator to transfer part or all of its annual quota to one or more states. So as a reminder, this idea of the referee transfer provision was offered forward by the board and council to be developed further by the FMAT. Lacking details on how this process would operate, the FMAT attempted to flesh out the process to create a workable alternative. So this alternative offers that a neutral party match up transfer partners to ensure one or more states are not requesting too much quota or requesting transfers too early in the year. States are to project their own landings to determine when a transfer is needed, And once a state reaches 75% of their own quota, state personnel may notify the neutral party, which would most likely be the Commission's FMP coordinator for Bluefish. The coordinator would also maintain a spreadsheet of landings and projections by state. Once states submit a transfer request, the appropriate transfer amount would be determined by the neutral party. So the refereed approach would be accompanied by this transfer rule. And what we've come up with so far is that any transfer requested by a state is reduced by multiplying the requesting state's percent. Sorry, I'll start that over. Any transfer request by a state is reduced by multiplying the requesting state's percent share of the coastwide projected overage. And that remaining quota is not transferred and stays with the state as a surplus of quota and reserved for other states to request. So this may be a little bit confusing written down on paper, but we also have it listed in the FMAT summary where we walk through step by step and provide some tables that might make it a little bit clearer. And then I'll also pull up a few of these tables just to quickly demonstrate what this means. So the neutral party would utilize recent trends in commercial fishing effort to determine the projected landings for the year. And for example, this table displays the average commercial landings by month in pounds for 2017 to 2019. This would help inform when states land their quota and at what time in the year based on recent trends. So the neutral party would utilize the same method used annually by council staff to project recreational landings. The column to the far right presents the projected underages in green and the projected overages in red. Under the transfer rule, if New York requested 100,000 pounds of quota from New Jersey, New York's share of the coastwide overage is 36%. As we can see here, Rhode Island also comprises a large percent of the projected overage, and they represent 64%. So New York would only receive 36% of their transfer request, which equals 36,000 pounds. And 64,000 pounds are left with New Jersey, not transferred, which would help serve as a reserve quota should Rhode Island request a transfer from New Jersey. After FMAT discussion, a recommendation for removal of this alternative was made. While the FMAT liked the idea of equitability, the proposed method may simply replicate the current process with added restrictions and analysis requirements that will overcomplicate the current system. The FMAT was concerned that states would not be inclined to opt into a system that restricts flexibility in negotiating transfers and provides a loss of autonomy. The refereed approach may also provide an unfair advantage to states that harvest their quota earlier in the year, allowing them to request for transfers earlier. The FMAT thought that the rule would increase the frequency of transfers as well, as you can see in the example that when a request is made, often or almost always, it would be reduced by a certain amount. As well as the fact that each state's projections would need to be updated continuously every time a transfer was requested. Altogether, all these concerns create a significant burden on state personnel and would be challenging for the neutral party to coordinate. So the AP also had opportunity to comment on the state-to-state transfers, and 2 of its members were in support of the refereed approach, and a 3rd member was concerned that transfers can lead to localized depletion. Another AP member emphasized that if the refereed approach is not adopted, the current method for state transfers should remain in the plan, saying that it adds much needed flexibility and provides stability for states with reduced quotas. We also received comment from the public that also voiced support for state-to-state transfers as they currently operate within the current FMP. He explained that the tool provides a much-needed relief for states that are dealing with reduced quotas, and without a state transfer this year, Rhode Island fishermen will be forced to increase regulatory discards when they catch bluefish when targeting other species. So here's just the summary of what I just went over, and as a reminder, the FMAT identified a number of concerns and recommends removal of this refereed approach for further development. And then here to wrap up, we've got all the recommendations for removal here. The FMAT found that sector allocations using the trigger approach was difficult to analyze, wasn't sure what the basis would be, and recommended removal. Pending a lack of biological basis, the FMAT recommends removal of the regional commercial allocations. This would be determined between now and the next meeting. And then structure B and D under recreational sector separation are recommended for removal. And then lastly, of course, what we just went over, the referee transfer approach is also recommended for removal. So this is the timeline we have as of today, but of course, things may shift depending on whether the council and board decide to remove for building from this amendment. And as a reminder, this decision needs to be made either at this meeting or in December to allow enough time for the rebuilding plan to go into effect due to the Magnuson-Stevens Act requirements of a 2-year rebuilding plan once the overfish designation is given. So between August, right now, and December, the FMAT will further refine the draft alternatives. In December 2020, we'll approve a final range of alternatives for inclusion in the draft amendment, also referred to by the council as the public hearing document. In February 2021, we'll approve the draft amendment for public comment, and this will keep us in line to have a formal submission of the amendment and the rebuilding plan to NOAA Fisheries by September 2021. And with that, if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to take them.
Okay, thanks, Dustin and Matt, and many thanks to the FMAT for all the work they've put in so far for looking at these different issues and options for us to discuss. I'll go ahead and open it up for some questions right now. I think if anyone has any questions that really drill down to any of the issues that Matt and Dustin presented today, I ask that you hold off on those for when we provide some guidance to the FMAT on this document. So any questions on the presentation?
You have Joe Cimino and then Dewey Hemmelwright.
Okay, Joe, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to both Matt and Dustin. That was a lot of info, but I do have one big question. I'll lead with, I support the idea of sector separations for a couple of reasons. One being I want to get away from MRIP as much as possible. And I thought that B did that for one sector, but that could only happen, as the FMAT pointed out, when we close the loophole and have 100% reporting. So that's down the line now, in my opinion. But the idea that there's no accountability except at the sub-ACL level surprises me. We're rebuilding this stock, and Dustin's example, let's flip it, because the private has so much more of that allocation. Let's say they go over considerably. The FMAT is suggesting that with C, at a sub level, NOAA's going to be okay with still filtering down that entire target for, say, the for-hire fleet. So there's no accountability at the ACL level. I almost don't see the difference then with having their own ACLs if the only accountability is at a sub-ACL. I'm confused and would like an explanation of how that actually differs if the payback or accountability measures weren't at the ACL level. Thank you.
Hi, Joe. Happy to take that one. I just switched headsets, so can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. So just to clarify, are you saying you're unsure of why B is not the preferable alternative, structure B up in the top right?
Well, I am surprised to hear that accountability would only happen at the sub-ACL. So in other words, using C, there's a rec ACL, the private mode goes way over theirs, but we can still give the for-hire fleet the next year their entire allocation at a sub-ACL level because there's no accountability at the ACL level. That surprises me.
I see. Yeah, I mean, that is the big difference between how things operate right now and how things would operate under this perceived this recreational sector separation idea. The reason, or at least one of the reasons, why the for-hire sector has voiced concern at time and time again about not wanting to be part of the private angler sector, not part of the whole recreational sector, is that they're tired of the wild swings in MRIP data, the fact that participation by private anglers may vary considerably year to year, and that they don't want to face these accountability measures as they have in the past, which requires that, you know, management measures be reduced or potential pound for pound paybacks be implemented. They don't want to be affected by that any longer. So by splitting at the sub ACL level, you're removing, you're basically jumping down accountability one step, so it's more targeted. So if the for-hire sector operates within its limits, utilizes the bag limit, the minimum size that they're afforded, and they do not exceed their landings limit, and they do not have a large amount of discards, then they would be unaffected by the private angler sector, which may, you know, way exceed its limits in any given year. So that was why this was taken. But you're right, if it's the desire of the stakeholders and the desire of the board and council that any recreational overage, regardless of sector, be applied to everyone, then sure, yes, the current system we have in place would be the way to go.
And, you have a follow-up on that, Joe, or is that good?
No, I think that's good. I mean, Garfo's here. If they're confirming that can happen at the sub ACL level, then that answers my question. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Next up is Dewey Hamorite.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me, Chris?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, I got two questions. One of them might be for Dustin. On his last comments about bluefish bycatch, I was curious as what species or what fishery would Rhode Island be targeting fish that they'll have bluefish bycatch, and what gear would they be using if that's the case? That's one question, and I'll wait for the second question.
Yeah, thanks, Dewey. So Dean Passant from Rhode Island was actually the person who spoke to me. Really nice guy. We had a conversation, a few conversations. I don't actually know. He didn't get into the gear type that he was using, but he did mention offhand that fishing for scup, he occasionally gets bluefish bycatch. He named it like one or two other species, and I'm forgetting at this moment, but I think scup was mentioned.
Yeah, and you don't know what gear type he uses, is that correct? Or what's the, for Rhode Island, what is the gear, the preferable gear that harvests the amount of bluefish?
Why don't we let, Jason has his hand up, Joe, he might be able to answer.
Yeah, let's go to Jason McNamee or someone from Rhode Island and probably be able to better answer that question. So, Jack?
Hi, everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So we are talking about a gill net in the case of Dean. I do have some comments I want to make, but you can call me whenever you're ready.
All right, yeah, thanks. Yeah, Dewey has another question, and we'll go to that right now.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, sorry.
Just to add, Dean's comment letter on this action is part of the briefing materials there as well, if people want more information. Thank you.
Yeah. I read his comment, Dewey, I read his comment letter, but it didn't drill down too specific. It was kind of overall thing, and I was just curious. You know, a scup's a lot smaller. I didn't know a scup's a lot smaller fish sometimes than a bluefish, and I was just curious what the gear would be used. Also, my next question would be for issue three. I think the last slide, and this is for Matt. Given you have the averages of some of the fisheries of the species caught bluefish and the different months. Have you done any analysis, particularly I know for North Carolina, we have an offshore fishery in federal water, and we got an inshore fishery. And I was just curious, I think we did the averages of pounds quote each month the last 3 years. I think it's last slide maybe. I'm not sure for issue 3. But have you done anything to look at the, I don't think it give a clearer picture of, some states have offshore fishery and some inshore that would give a different picture as far as the different scenarios that we're looking at here for things. And I was just curious, has any of that been looked at? And when you gave the average of quote each month, is it by state landings or is it by VTR landings? State recorded landings, state fisheries, or VTR landings? Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Dewey. I need a little bit of clarification. Are you referring to the minimum default allocations, the slide on the screen?
No, I'm referring to the part where the table, and it might have not been issue 3, the table that showed the average weight landed each month for bluefish, an average for 3 years. I think 17, 18, and 19 is what the graph I was looking at.
Is I'm trying to call. Oh,
yep.
Is this?
Yep, that right there. And the average there. And is this from VTR or from state reported landings? I'm trying to get an idea of what's called federal water and what's called state water. And I don't know where that slopes at.
Okay, I understand. So yeah, this is issue 8 related to the commercial state-to-state transfers.
Okay.
This, I believe, and Dustin, please correct me if I'm wrong, is from the ACCSP commercial database. So these are predominantly state landings through the dealer database that ACCSP works through. And based off the monthly, this is how it's been how things have been set up. And
so what I'm asking or trying to get to, where in this document can I find the difference of VTR reported federal landings by the vessels, and then you got state landings which are separate, and then sometimes you don't have to have the a bluefish permit is what I'm asking for, because I'm not seeing that separation, and it's important because we got 2 different fisheries in some states to give a clearer picture. And so I was wondering if that could be possible in the future to break this down by how much is being caught in federal waters, and then what's the amount in state waters.
Right. Okay, I understand, Dewey. Yeah, I don't think we have anything in this presentation that really hones in on that. However, in the specifications presentation, you may recall there's a figure in there that shows the exact percentage of landings in state versus federal waters in a given year. And I believe that it's more than 90% of the landings are coming from state waters. I can pull up that information and get it over to you at some point. However, yeah, it's not in this presentation.
Yeah, but as we're drilling down with these different method things, some states are affected. Everybody's getting affected by the bluefish. These cutbacks commercially, big time. But what I'm saying is, in certain states, 90% of our bluefish don't come from state waters in North Carolina. So
right.
I'm just trying to paint that picture to give a total things of the different scenarios here of of just what's portrayed here. But thank you, and we can talk more offline. Thank you.
Right. Thanks for your question, Dewey. I understand the discrepancies there, that some of the VTRs are not captured in the commercial database and that ACCSP uses, and we've worked pretty closely with them to ensure that the commercial landings that we are seeing encompass the full universe of those landings. But yeah, I'd be interested to talking a little more offline about that as well. So thank you.
And one last thing, when you look at this issue here, and you talk about 90% of the landings, according to y'all or what you've looked at, come from state waters. Well, in North Carolina in January and February, I promise you that 90% of them 2 years there and then 2 months didn't come from state water landings. So just to show you how it's kind of skewed a little bit of the average here, looking at the particular years and where they came from. So it's just to paint a clearer picture is what I'm looking for. Thank you.
Yeah, I understand. Thanks, Stuart.
All right, before I go to other questions, just going to circle back to Jay McNamee to see if his comments were I guess, about Dewey's questions of the Rhode Island fishery, or are they just comments in general? If they're comments in general on these issues, we'll just hold those for now when we get into that part. So, Jay?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I think they are kind of related to what we were just discussing, but they're separate and apart. So you can kind of keep the queue in order.
Okay, all right, great. Any other questions on the presentation?
Okay, thanks, Chris. So Jay did have his hand up as next in line for questions, and then there was Adam Nowalski, and then there are some members of the public that have questions. I don't know if you're going to take those or not.
Let's see how this goes. Yeah, we'll see how this goes in terms of time. Adam, you're up.
Great, thank you very much. So with regards to the recreational sector separation, you touched on a lot of issues that have come up, and this was the purpose, this was the interest in having this item in the development process so far by the board and the council. Clearly we're aware of the rec issues. Clearly there have been some members of the for-hire sector that have been pushing for this, and we've certainly unearthed a lot of issues here. We're now at the point where we're saying, if I heard you correctly, that we would continue to hold the for-hire sector accountable to MRIP with everything right now because of lack of complete VTR reporting. We have concerns about development of other options in this document, including transfers. So I guess what I'm wondering at this point is, if we leave it in at this point, what kind of development would we actually expect on this option in the coming months, given the complexities you've raised so far? And has there been any discussion by the FMAT? And I know this board has not been as included on the concept of rec reform as the Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Board, but certainly the council's aware. Given the need to move this forward with regards to the rebuilding timeline, could the FMAT have any discussion so far about the possibility that this could be moved somewhere else, rec sector separation, like rec reform, which hasn't been completely launched off the ground? We're hoping to accomplish that this afternoon. I believe, Mr. Chairman, you're going to make an announcement to the Bluefish board that they're invited to listen in and potentially participate, since it may include them. So those would be the questions. Given all of the issues that have been raised, what would we expect with development if we leave option C in? And has there been any discussion about possibly moving it to a different venue that would give us the time to do the things we've said you'd need time to do, including looking at completing all of the state-by-state VTR reporting, so we get a complete picture that way?
Thanks, Adam. I'll take on this one. So yeah, you've identified the fact that recreational sector separation does complicate a number of other issues in this amendment. If we were to leave it in using structure C as the preferred approach, we would come back to the boarding council with different allocation alternatives that we've already identified. I'm going to bring them up here on the screen. And essentially, we would be using the FMAT recommendation, and really the only way that the FMAT could move forward is developing alternatives that would be using MRIP data to develop allocations, and at first, accountability using MRIP data. That would be, the next step forward, and really all we have as an alternative here, given the rebuilding plan timeline. If the board and council is concerned about moving forward with this approach, wants more time for recreational sector separation to be developed, considered, the FMAT has not discussed it since at their last meeting in terms of moving it to recreational reform. But I do recall from our FMAT meeting back in, I want to say it was April, the initial reaction to recreational sector separation as an option was that it should be a more than one species consideration. The original FMAT thought was that maybe this should be handled on a multi-species basis. So I could see support from the FMAT removing this from the amendment as is and putting it into recreational sector separation, or sorry, recreational reform. But at this time, I would also need to consult and make sure we build consensus from the FMAT. And maybe Cynthia and Matt might be able to chime in as well, since they are also on the FMAT.
Yeah, just to add, this is Matt. Yeah, so Dustin kind of hit the nail on the head there, the way that things have been developed. And I think honing in on the specific flow chart that the FMAT would like to recommend here, which was option C, as you indicated, Adam, that will really allow the FMAT to continue to develop the provisions that would be set up within the for-hire sector separation. We'd be able to focus on transfers as we move forward, since we know what the flow chart would actually be, how things would be allocated. So it would give us a little bit more, leeway and flexibility to kind of explore a little bit more widely surrounding this issue, instead of having a variety of different flow charts that we're trying to, hone in on and develop these provisions for 4 different options instead of just one. So there's definitely more work that can be done here that the FMAT would look into after this meeting, once we receive direction from the council and board. But Dustin was, absolutely correct. Back at the April FMAT meeting, the FMAT did recommend removal from this action and potential inclusion with other species to, make it more of a multi-species comprehensive action. So yeah.
Thanks for that. And yeah, we'll definitely circle back to this as Matt and Dustin go through these issues to get specific feedback from the board and council. That's a good question. I think it's something for all of us to think about. Any other questions from either the board or council? If not, I may just go to the public real quick for any questions they might have.
Sorry, Chris, I was on mute. You have Jason McMee and Tom Fody.
Okay, we'll go ahead and take Jason and Tom, go to the public, and then I'd like to then get into the discussion of providing feedback to the FMAT on these issues. So Jay, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So my question is back on the state-to-state quota transfers. And you had a table up earlier that I think might be helpful to pop back up. It was that average by month. Yeah, that one. So I do have a question, I promise. So what I'm trying to get at is the FMAT has suggested this notion of a refereed approach is kind of like what we have now, but worse. And that's actually what I want to drill into a little bit. But I thought, just to be very specific about why I've been a proponent of trying to do a better job with this system, is you saw earlier in the it's actually the next table down, you see that Rhode Island and New York are kind of some of the bigger movers of quota along the coast. And if you flip back to the last table, you also see that the New York fishery tends to be more in the spring, the Rhode Island fishery tends to be more in the fall. And so it kind of sets up this weird dynamic where, you know, New York will have issues earlier in the year and will be, you know, kind of out going to different states, seeing if they can get quota transfers kind of earlier, and then Rhode Island wouldn't do that until later. And so Rhode Island gets incentivized to kind of go out and ask for transfers before we actually need them. And so my whole point of kind of bringing this idea up was to try and get away from or develop a system that is a little bit like, we don't want to compete with New York and kind of rush out and ask for things that we might not need, you know, at the time. But I guess now to my question, Dustin, it sounds like the things that shook out of this idea were sticking with what we have now. And by all, for all intents and purposes, it's been working okay even this year. Even though New York got out before we did, we were still able to get some transfers, which I'm really appreciative of. But the only other option that we still have available is this refereed approach. And so if you could clarify a little bit more, you know, why the FMAT thought, you know, what makes that worse? How, you know, I sort of have described the issue that we face in Rhode Island. Could you help me understand why the refereed approach really doesn't help that?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I'll try. So it was difficult to, I think the most challenging part of developing this alternative is understanding how a neutral party would decide who and who can and who cannot receive quota from a state that's willing to transfer. And lacking any sort of, you know, arbitrary decisions as the way to move forward, you have to do some sort of mathematical calculation. So the only way that we thought that this could be done from an objective standpoint is by projecting catch, as we have done here in the table, finding out who's projected to exceed their quota based on prior years of landings, which would, you know, capture Rhode Island's trends, given that they harvest later in the year, and then reducing any transfer request from one state to another by their share of that overage. And then basically that reduction allows for a buffer of surplus quota to be accessed later by another state. However, the FMAT identified there's a few ways of kind of gaming the system. One way being you just request quota several times, or you request more than you need, all of which, you know, increases the amount of communication that needs to go back and forth, and it kind of increases the workload of both state personnel and the neutral party, without altogether too much benefit in the end. Perhaps the reason this approach, this refereed approach, didn't go far enough forward or to everyone's liking is we just didn't have our brilliant aha moment where we were able to find a rule that satisfied the requirement of making it fair and equitable. So lacking, you know, a great idea yet from the FMAT, from myself, or from the board on how exactly that would operate, this is kind of what we ended up with. And the FMAT thought it would just increase, you know, paperwork, increase communication, and may not actually end up with that much better of a result. And I hope that helps. Happy to take any follow-ups.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation, Dustin. And yeah, just from my perspective, since we receive a lot of calls for quota transfers for a variety of species, one thing we've done in North Carolina, in the case of menhaden, for example, is yeah, we anticipate that multiple states will contact us during the year, and we try to ration out our quota transfers to the different states, knowing that we'll probably get contacted multiple times. At other times, we've in the case of spiny dogfish, since we're really not sure what our landings will be any given year, we will, instead of doing one big transfer to a state, we'll do multiple smaller transfers to ensure that that state can have their fishery remain open, but also not result in us closing early because we transfer too much quota. So I guess every state deals with it differently. And I guess when we get to this issue, a question that I'd have, not now, but when we talk about it, is how is the state-to-state transfer issue for bluefish different than other species that we do quota transfers for? All right, next up is Tom Fody. Tom?
I put my hand down.
We did? Okay, yeah, sorry, I can't see the hand raise function here. My apologies. Tony, how many members of the public would like to ask a question?
I just really quickly, Dewey, do you still need to have your hand up?
Yes.
Okay, so you have both Maureen Davidson and Dewey Hemmelwright as council and commission members that have questions, and then you have 3 members of the public that have questions.
Okay, I'll stay with the council and the board. Maureen Davidson. Maureen?
Maureen, you're just self-muted. You just need to click on that microphone to unmute yourself, to turn it to green. There you go.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chris. I wanted to speak in response to Jace about transfers going to both New York and Rhode Island. Right now, we're not comfortable with the refereed approach to transfers. So far, bluefish transfers have definitely worked for the benefit of New York State fishermen. And we do like the ability to sort of talk straight, talk to another state directly and talk about how much fish is available. Is this a good time to ask? And sort of work cooperatively with our neighboring states. I would like to say is that we don't want to be competitors with Rhode Island for transfers. I do realize that we do tend to get our fish earlier in the year than Rhode Island, but now that's sort of been brought to the forefront of my mind when I have to think about transfers, I think I would rather talk with Rhode Island to see if we could work cooperatively to make sure that we can get the transfers that we need when we need them, and sort of not letting New York sweep the market before Rhode Island can get their fish. So that's just something that I think we could do before we would consider perhaps going to a referee transfer system. All right, thank you.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I think we're definitely going into questions and comments on the issues that provide feedback. So I'm going to hold off on any more for that, but I just want to give the public a quick opportunity. If they have any questions on the presentation, just keeping it to questions right now. So again, it's being very mindful of the time we have here. I want to make sure that we have enough. We give the FMAT the feedback that they need. So Tony, who from the public do we have that would like to ask a question at this point?
No problem. Greg D. Domenico, Jim Fletcher, and Mike Wayne.
All right, Greg, you're up. Thanks.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is a question for Matt and Dustin. You guys realize how curious I have been regarding the issue of catch-based approach versus landings-based approach. Can you guys explain to me what measurable results there would be and or biological results or management results related to choosing catch-based versus landings-based? And then my second question is, is regardless of which one you choose, is it possible to keep the commercial fishery managed by landings and choose what you guys want for the other groups? Thank you.
I can tackle this one, give it a try. This is Matt. Thanks for those questions, Greg. I'm going to try to address your second question first, if it's possible to do commercial allocations with landings data and the recreational allocations with catch data. My first thought there would be that that is not able to happen, since we're using the full population of landings or catch, whatever data that is. And when you're allocating, you need the same overall sum to try to get the complete allocation percentages. So, that would be my first instinct there, is that is not able to happen. However, it's something that we could discuss with the FMAT to see, if there's any different perspective along there. In regards to your first question, what sort of results we would be expecting? I think I would need a little bit of clarification from you on exactly what you mean. However, in terms of the reason that we're discussing the catch-based allocations, we've discussed this back and forth quite a bit. But the main reason for those, the catch data being proposed and continue to be available here as an option, is due to the vast number of scoping comments that we're getting, talking about recreational anglers being interested in the catch and release aspect of bluefish. And the FMAT does understand that this fishery is not catch and release for everybody. Obviously, there's the commercial aspect, and then there's the recreational aspect of people that like to take home some fish. But trying to account for the vast number of comments that we did get surrounding the catch and release aspect, that's why this catch data has been continued to be presented throughout this amendment development. I'm not positive if that answered your question related to the results. So if not, if you could kind of either reword or clarify what you meant, I would appreciate it.
Sure, Matt. So I understand the genesis of this entire issue. You and I know that I've been asking you these questions since this amendment started, and one of your responses is what made me curious, and the response was recognition of recreational discards. That's all fine and good. They're asking for a different form of management to accommodate their fisheries. In accommodating their fisheries, will it make it easier on you to manage their landings? Will it decrease uncertainty? Will it contribute to the rebuilding of the species during the time we're in rebuilding? And of course, that begs the question, if you have high certainty on commercial landings, we know that the discards have been debated and we know that they are small. That's why I'm begging the question that you should consider first the reasons why you're doing it and articulate them from a biological standpoint, or as it relates to uncertainty of recreational landings. And then, of course, the second point being you have to give a pretty good reason why you can't continue to manage the commercial sector on landings. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. Yep.
Okay, next up is James Fletcher. James, got a question?
The question is, does the president's executive order change the way that the ASMFC and council is doing business? Because at the present time, 13.1 million recreational fishermen in salt water are getting in excess of 80% of the quota. Now, it seems to me that the 300 million people in this country that need fish should be able to get them. So my question to you is, does the executive order change the way that we have been doing business? And does the council and ASMFC look at the allocation in a different manner, given 13.1 million people 60 to 80% of the fish? So I'd like an answer. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I don't think I have an answer unless someone else in the council does. I know this will be discussed, the executive order will be discussed at next week's Mid-Atlantic Council meeting. Guess we can just kind of address that there unless somebody had an immediate answer for Mr. Fletcher. Okay, hearing none. Next question I'll go to, or person that asked the question is Mike Wayne. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So my question is about MRIP data. And we all know some of the challenges associated with using, in uncertainty, using the MRIP data at the sector level. So I'm just wondering what FMAT said about using MRIP data at the mode level to calculate allocations for sector separation. And has the service weighed in on that at all?
This is Matt. I can try to tackle that one. Thanks for the question, Mike. Obviously, there's concerns with the MRIP data. As we indicated, you know, the MRIP data has very different numbers of fish landings compared to the VTR data. And, you know, we're all pretty familiar that the further that you break down the MRIP data, you know, by state, by mode, the higher that the PSEs can get. And the FMAT has taken this into consideration and trying to account for it as best they can. However, as Dustin indicated during the presentation, not all states require VTRs to the degree that would be necessary to monitor for higher sector separation. So at this point, MRIP is, you know, what we have and what we're working with. And the FMAT is continuing to discuss the best ways to work through for higher sector separation. But breaking down the data at the mode level creates these higher PSEs, which is definitely an area of concern. I think it's pretty, I think the FMAT captured it fairly well in the discussion document as well.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. Does that answer your question, Mike, or do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I was just curious if the agency has weighed in on the use of MRIP data at the mode level for these sector separation discussions.
Yeah, so we do have GARFO representation on the FMAT. So, you know, I think that the FMAT recommendations include the approval by all FMAT members. If there's, you know, someone that doesn't, you know, confirm exact agreement with something that's being stated in the FMAT, that would be clearly articulated in the document. So I think, you know, the way that things were laid out in the document has GARFO's recognition within it. And if I'm kind of overstepping there, I would turn to GARFO just for any additional comment.
All right, thanks. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to the fifth item on the agenda, which is to provide guidance to the FMAT on the Bluefish allocation and rebuilding draft amendment. Matt, and before we do, Matt and Dustin, are you going to kind of go through, I guess, a similar format that you did with our last meetings, where you go issue by issue and the board and council provide feedback on each of those?
Yeah, I'll bring up those summary tables now that provide kind of questions. If we do move into motion territory, I will turn it over to Maya to take control of the presentation. And just so you know, Maya, all we're doing is covering these tables here one by one. So maybe once we get into more board discussion at the board and council discussion at the very end, maybe I'll turn it over to you.
All right, great, thanks. So yeah, we'll go ahead and open up to the board and council on any feedback on these issues. And as I said, we'll just go issue by issue. And I think the board and council at this point is going to really need to think about any options, approaches, et cetera, that should be removed from the amendment. And the FMAT has made some recommendations for that. This would allow the FMAT time to focus on the items that the board and council think are the most important, and would also keep this amendment on schedule. So anyways, open it up for questions and comments by the board and council. Tony, who do we have in the queue?
Right now, I don't have anyone. Here, Tony Delarnia. And Dustin, I don't know, you're on issue 2. I don't know if you're planning on starting with 2 or 1.
1 was not discussed. That's the FNP goals and objectives. So what we'll be starting with today. But thanks.
Yep. And you're only showing partial screen, not the full screen slide.
I'm not in presentation mode so that I can flip through more easily. Is that what you're referring to?
It's fine.
Hey, Tony Delarnia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Chris. It's my understanding you're asking for a recommendation as to what to do regarding this issue, and I agree with the FMAT. Remove the trigger, and I would recommend that we stay with the phased-in approach. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Any other comments and feedback on issue 2, sector allocations?
I don't see any additional hands.
Okay, is there any objection to the feedback on removing the trigger option from sector allocations?
I don't see any hands, and if somebody thinks they have their hand up, they do not currently.
Okay, all right, great. Oh, that was easy. Okay, so let's move on to issue 3, please.
So Chris, here we have a just basically update of FMAT progress. At this point, there's no recommendation for removal, so perhaps we can move through this quickly, but perhaps if any board or council members have any concerns with how this has been shaking out thus far in regards to the phase-in trigger or minimum default allocations, any comment there would be helpful.
All right, thanks. I did have a question on the trigger option. I think in the presentation you showed the trigger being the average commercial quota over a certain time period. I think that match up with the options in the amendment. Were those the commercial quotas that were in place after the transfer from the recreational fishery?
Yeah, so those should be the final commercial quotas at the end of the year. So yes.
Okay, I guess did the FMAT discuss I guess the possibility that with the low cat ACLs while we're rebuilding that transfers may not happen at all, or they won't happen to that magnitude, and maybe looking at I guess a different trigger threshold that maybe I guess matches the base commercial allocation before the transfers they received in the past.
Yeah, I think that was discussed a little bit, not to any crazy extent, and staff proposed the 20-year, 10-year, and 5-year average commercial quotas as the trigger point because, right now we're in rebuilding. So when you encompass that longer timeline where the quotas were larger, obviously that's going to inflate these trigger points or these trigger thresholds. And I believe that the FMAT was concerned about, hitting a trigger during the rebuilding plan, just trying to make sure things are consistent and stable. So that was a point of concern. However, I think the FMAT would be happy to discuss different levels or thresholds for that trigger, whether, we could consider a moving average or, a different time series, any sort of information or direction that you could provide in terms of some other approach that you would like to see would definitely be appreciated.
And thanks. Yeah, just see if any as we go through this issue, if any other members of the board and council have any thoughts on that. I think that was a good answer. Gave me some things I didn't think about. Tony, who do we have in the queue for providing feedback on this issue?
Nicola Meserve.
Okay, Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with what you just raised there is to have the FMAT look at different trigger levels. I was struck by the fact that the the lowest trigger level considered right now is 6.67 million pounds. And right now we have a commercial quota of 2.77, I believe it is, million pounds. So I think I liked your idea of having the FMAT look at the commercial quota history prior to the transfers from the recreational fishery, so to possibly get a trigger that would be lower than 6.67 million pounds. And I wasn't clear if the FMAT is recommending removal of the trigger approach that would evenly distribute the surplus to all states except for those that are very minimal.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
A follow-up as well. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. I do believe in the document there was no formal recommendation from the FMAT to do away with what I would call option 1, 2, and 3. That's Dustin, if you can go to slide 11. So yeah, Nicola, just to provide that background again for everyone, once the trigger level is hit, the FMAT discussed these 3 options of the different trigger percentages that could be allocated. You can see that it's 0.05, 0.1, and 0.25 for states that have less than 1% baseline allocation, and then the remaining allocation is divided evenly amongst those states. The FMAT didn't think that this was the best approach. I don't recall them specifically recommending removal, but the reason that they didn't think it was the best approach was because, for example, we set this threshold of 1%. And if you look, for example, at Connecticut, Connecticut has a baseline allocation of 1.27%. And North Carolina, for example, has a baseline allocation of 32.03%. So there's a vast discrepancy between that baseline allocation that would result in the same additional allocation after the trigger has been hit. And the FMAT discussed that, that may not be as appropriate as what we see here on slide 13, which was the option 4 that was proposed. Dustin, if you can move to, yeah, thank you. So that's why the FMAT decided to add this range of baseline quotas and have, a couple different levels of how the additional quota can be set up. So you see the 0.25%, and then you have 3% for the range of 1 to 5%. And then once you get beyond a 5% baseline quota, the additional quota is split evenly amongst the remaining states. The FMAT did feel that this was the best option provided, and I think would be happy to explore additional options. So long story short, to answer your question, there was no specific recommendation to remove options 1 through 3, but option 4 is definitely the preferred by the FMAT, that they're willing to continue to look at other options that would be similar.
Okay, follow up, Nicola?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I agree with the FMAT that the equal distribution options 1 through 3 are problematic, and I would support their being removed, and this option 4 continuing to be developed. I'd also suggest another option that would have the surplus distributed based on a different time frame, like is being considered in the other options, you looking at either the 5 or the 10-year average of landings to determine where the surplus is distributed. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Nicola.
Any other feedback on issue 3? Tony, is anyone in the queue?
I do not see any other hands raised.
Okay, any objection to suggestion?
Sorry about that. Mike Luisi's hand just went up.
All right, Mike Luisi?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So based on the comment that that Matt made a minute ago regarding the equal distribution and the vast difference between a state like Connecticut and a state like North Carolina, given their baseline allocations, I wonder if under this alternative, if it would make sense to perhaps add another range of baseline quota, perhaps looking at states that have maybe more than 10%, and just adding one additional consideration, because you know, when Matt was discussing the difference between Connecticut and North Carolina, yes, it's 1.2 versus 32%. But if you look at a state like New York and North Carolina, North Carolina still has 3 times as much baseline allocation as New York, yet they're getting treated equally. And I just wonder if it's something that the board and the council would support, perhaps just adding another range there, maybe over 10, or, you know, so between, you have 0 to 1, 1 to 5, 5 to 10, and then over 10. Just something that came to mind as this discussion has been going on. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Any thoughts from the board and council on the FMAT looking at that option in addition to the one here on the screen and the one that Nicola suggested? Okay, if not, I think that those would be good ones for the FMAT to continue developing. Any objection to the FMAT not moving forward with the options that provide an equal distribution to all the states?
Maureen Davidson has her hand up. I don't know if it was to object or for a comment.
Okay, Maureen.
No, I just wanted to comment on what Mike had said, because there are other states that would be in the same category as New York, such as New Jersey, Virginia, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. And so perhaps Mike's point might be something that would be good for the FMAT to consider.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think it kind of rounds out the options. It's before we leave this this issue. One that's up on the screen here is the minimum default allocations. I'd like to get some feedback from the board and council on which range of percentages is minimum default allocations the FMAT should continue to develop.
So far, no hands up, Chris.
Mr. Chairman, this is Matt. I can just add a little context here for you. So in terms of the minimum default allocations, the FMAT did feel that the range provided was a sufficient range of percentages. However, as detailed in the discussion document, they did confirm that 1% is way too high, which obviously if we're thinking about de minimis, 1% is much, much higher than what that would actually be. And we're trying to model that off of, the de minimis aspects and then developing that sufficient range moving forward. So 1% definitely too high, but happy with the range that we do have.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, I've noticed that in the tables that 1% could result in quota being allocated to states that really don't have a directed fishery or a fishery at all, and can just kind of further complicate quota monitoring for the other states and maybe add more quota transfer requests. So any thought from the board and council on not pursuing the 1% minimum default allocation option or any of the other options listed there in the table?
Nicola Meserve.
Okay, Nicola.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd be comfortable removing the 1% allocation. When I had suggested the minimum default allocations, I was certainly thinking more in line with the 0.1%, which was similar to what those, very minimal quota states have currently. So I think 0.5% is a sufficient maximum to be considered in the range of alternatives. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. Any other board or council members with comments or thoughts on minimum default allocations or anything else for issue 3?
I see no hands, Chris.
Okay. Yeah, we'll move on to issue 4, regional commercial allocations. So any feedback from the board and council on this option?
Tony Delarnia.
Okay, Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to see this remain in place. I'm a very strong proponent of regional management. And so I would like to see this remain in place for further development. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other comments or feedback from the board and council on regional commercial allocation?
Tom Foti?
Hey, Tom?
Unlike Tony, I've not been a supporter of regional allocations because a lot of times New Jersey was trying to be forced into putting in regions that it didn't want to be in. So I have a problem with that.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Anyone else?
I do not see any other names.
Okay. Yes, we've heard two different thoughts on this one. Is there any objection by board or council members on the FMAT continuing to develop this option? Not asking if you support it or not, but for just the FMAT to continue developing this option for the amendment.
I do not see any hands raised at this time.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I guess that'll continue to be developed by the FMAT and for further development. So I guess on to the next issue. Unless Matt and Dustin, you're looking for more feedback from the board and council on issue 4.
I think that's it for issue 4. Kind of like the summary says, the FMAT already intends on looking to see if there's any biological backing to the regional allocations, and if not, would recommend removal at the next meeting.
Okay, yeah, and I know there was some additional analysis suggested by the FMAT, such as looking at the contribution of landings by the small number of trips landing high amounts of bluefish. So yeah, look forward to seeing more development on that. So I guess with that, we'll move on to the next issue for feedback. So yeah, for hire sector separation. Any feedback, comments on this?
Adam Nowalski, Doug Hamans, and that's all for now.
Thanks, Adam.
Great, thanks very much. Since our last decision to leave this in for further development, I think the FMAT has done a great job of continuing to look at this issue. They've offered us some different scenarios, recommended which ones would definitely be a no-go. And one of those elements of a no-go would be option B, which would be at the ACL level. So now that we're talking about taking this and splitting it pretty much entirely at the recreation level, I think this is almost become a recreational issue as opposed to a recreational commercial issue. Given the number of issues that have been highlighted already, including the fact that we are now proposing holding, if we do these allocations, we're going to hold the for hire accountable to the MRIP numbers, at least in the short term, which has really been the cause of most of our problems we've had all along. We've highlighted the need to find a way to get all for hire operators reporting via VTRs. The suggestion that for hire operators be excluded from an allocation if they have not been submitting VTRs, I don't think is reasonable, assuming they've not been submitting VTRs because they've not been required to go ahead and punish someone to adhere to a regulation that they didn't have to adhere to. I think that's unreasonable. The concerns about further development of other options, and most importantly, since we last had this discussion, we're now on the cusp of having another venue with recreational reform where we continue to develop this option. So I am in favor of moving it there. I have spoken to a number of other board and council members, not everyone, so I don't know if there is enough support to do this by consensus, or if I need to make a motion on behalf of the board and the council, which I'm prepared to do, but specifically that would be to move further development of for-hire sector separation, specifically looking at further development of option C, moving that to rec reform, including looking at full implementation of VTRs, including those vessels that only operate in state waters. And I'll defer to you, Mr. Chairman, if you'd like me to go ahead with a formal motion, or if you'd like to query the group about whether or not it could be done by consent, and then come back to me if a motion's needed.
Yeah, let's we'll look for a little more board and council feedback, and if there's different opinions, I'll definitely come back to you for a motion. So next up is Doug Hammonds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's apparent where I stand on sector separation of the recreational fishery. I echo all of Adam's statements with the exception of I'd rather see it removed completely. Sector separation is a much larger issue than just bluefish. It does go across all species. South Atlantic wrestled with it for over 2 years for just the snapper grouper species. I would rather see it removed from this, and I would support in that motion if he makes that motion.
And thanks, Doug. Any other thoughts on this idea of removing the for-hire sector separation issue from this amendment and to address it more comprehensively in a recreational reform action?
You have Jason McNamee, Dewey Hemmelwright, Tom Fody, Mike Luisi, Nicole Meserve, and Justin Davis.
Okay, thanks. Go with start off with Jason McNamee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll answer the question that you asked. I did have another comment on the more specific question in front of us here, but I'll maybe start answering the question you just asked. And I'm a little, so I was kind of processing what Adam said. I do agree that it needs to be addressed more comprehensively. I will say that I am nervous to remove it from here because of the comment that I think it was Dewey made, in that I don't want it to go away altogether. And so having it kind of live at a couple different levels, I understand creates work, but gives me some comfort that it just won't disappear. So if I could be given some comfort that it will actually move to, a more comprehensive higher level, and we will get a chance to make a case for it and think it through, get some public comment on it, I think I could support that. But I need to know exactly where it's going, exactly what we're talking about before, I would be comfortable with that.
Okay, thanks. And I see you had some other comments just on this issue in general too, right?
Yeah, thanks. So maybe just real quick, I would be fine removing, so if this ends up staying in, I would be fine with removing option B. I'm not as keen about removing option D at this point, and in large part that has to do with I'm having a little difficulty understanding the FMAT comments on that and the nuance between D and C. So for the time being, I would prefer leaving D in, but would be okay removing B. B as in.
Okay, yeah, no, I appreciate that. Dewey Hemmelwright.
Yeah, I kind of, I didn't have my hand, or I had my hand up and went down, but I agree with Jake's comments there about where this is going. The South Atlantic Council looked at some of these things for the snapper grouper species and chose not this route, but different regions and different species and modes of fishing are different. So I would be interested in how this is going to play out, because I have a bunch of questions. I still have a bunch of questions with it. So, but I would like for it to see how it is going to play out, whether it's in another amendment or something different, just how it's going to work. Thank you.
And thanks, Dewey. Tom Foote.
I think this is more of a comprehensive thing we should look at with other species. I don't want a hodgepodge of rules, one for bluefish, one for summer flounder, one for black sea bass. It should be a uniform set of rules of how we handle this if we're going to ever do this. And I've always had my doubts about splitting the recreational sector because of some of the problems I've seen over the years. One sector fighting with another sector, whether it's the Gulf, whether it was in Maryland in the early days. So I have concerns with this, but I really think it should be in an overall amendment to look at how we do it, and if we're going to do it, how do we do it for summer flounder, black sea bass, and other species to make it easier. So I think I would approve moving this out of the rebuilding amendment, because I think it's just going to add confusion and a lot more controversy to something that you need to get done.
Thanks, Tom. Mike Luisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will say, I'll just put it out there as a member of the board, speaking for the state of Maryland. I do think I support Adam's suggestion. I have enough concern in moving forward with just bluefish, given that we would be required to use MRIP data to establish those allocations for the sectors. Provides enough concern in my mind that I think taking some time to consider how we might better inform those allocations to the sectors through possibly implementing mandatory state level VTR data down the road is where we should go. And I do like the idea that under the recreational reform initiative, which we'll be discussing later this afternoon, that this is developed further. And if it were to stay in the document, I would agree that B and D, I'd like to see those removed. I think accountability at the sector level, which is how I view option C, is where sector separation should be. And therefore, if it stays in, I'd like to see the other two options removed. But I would support the removal completely with an acknowledgement that it would be developed further and considered along with summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass under the recreational reform initiative. Thanks.
Thanks,
Chris,
Mike.
Chris, I just wanted to let you know that Joe Cimino and Mike Pentney, and I think Tony Delernia, I hadn't told him before, also raised their hands.
Oh, great, thanks. Nicola Meserve.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think my points have really been made already, so I'll be quick just to say that I agree that this should be removed from the bluefish amendment and considered in a more comprehensive and multi-species approach. When we do talk about rec reform later today, EVTRs is there as an issue that would require an amendment. So I think this for-hire sector separation and EVTRs for the for-hire fleet really belong together in their own document where they can be fully considered. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Nicola. Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think my comments are going to largely echo those of Jason McNamee, that I'm concerned about taking this out. The way I've felt about this all along was, absent the idea of whether this is something we should ultimately do, that we sort of owed it to the for-hire sector to pursue this and have this discussion, because it's something that there's been a lot of interest in, and hopefully if we put some work into it, really flesh this out and put it out in front of the public and get some public comment, we could maybe kind of put this to bed one way or the other for maybe not forever, but at least for a long period of time. My concern about taking this out in favor of putting it in some larger comprehensive initiative, whether that's the rec reform initiative or something else, is that management action doesn't yet exist. And so while I sense there's a commitment to undertaking such a management action, you know, it's not clear to me what that's going to be yet. And so my concern is just that this will sort of get lost in limbo. And also if the Fluke Scup Black Sea Bass Board initiates a rec reform management action, I think that's great. But then obviously it's kind of unclear to me how that would include Bluefish unless this board was working jointly with that board on that action. So those are my concerns about removing it at this point.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Joe Semina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to put my support towards you know, most of what's been mentioned and to alleviate Justin's fears that they do need to move together. That is Bluefish with flounder, scup, and sea bass, and really just a holistic approach to how this happens. And as the FMAT pointed out, maybe it doesn't happen until further down the road, and so rec reform discussions need to happen first. So I do hope, as both the council and board member, that we do show that commitment, you know, today and then again next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Mike Pentney.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to echo a lot of the previous comments supporting Adam's proposal to remove this at this time from this action, but address it more comprehensively, as we'll be discussing this afternoon in the holistic rec reform approach.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And Tony Delarney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support sector separation, but before you go to sector separation, you're going to have mandatory reporting for all the for-hire vessels, both on the state and federal level. And you're going to need a few years worth of data to see exactly what's being caught. And until that process is in place, I think sector separation, pursuing it at this time, is going to be an exercise in fertility. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we've heard mixed perspectives on this. I guess, Adam, I'll go back to you. It might be the easiest way to do this is if you want to put a motion up to see where people fall on whether to remove sector separation from this amendment and take it up in a more comprehensive amendment. I'll allow you to do that if you'd like.
On behalf of the Bluefish Board and the Council, I would move to stop further development of recreational sector separation by the FMAT as part of this amendment. I recommend that once the rec reform initiative be formally started, this issue be added to rec reform for Bluefish.
Sorry, Adam, I wasn't able to transition over to my end time, and I am admittedly one of the worst motion takers at the commission. So if you don't mind repeating
Hey,
that.
Justin, can we actually, Justin, in order to keep everything correct in our files, can we actually switch over to Maya so we do this properly?
I will have.
So I'll offer another alternative. If you want to move on, I'll type something up and send it over. Or if you want to dispense with this now, we'll take the time to do it. Whatever your preference is.
I think it's fine, Adam. Just give us 1 second. And then if you can just read slowly for Maya, and you'll be able to see what she's typing, so you'll be able to see the pace that she's going.
I'm ready whenever.
Let me know.
She's ready for you.
I move to remove recreational for-hire sector separation from further development of this amendment. Further development of for-hire sector separation should be considered under comprehensive recreational reform initiative. and that motion would be on behalf of the board and the council.
And Maya, if you could just write motion by, and then below that say board, and then council below board. Yep, and then put Mr. Nowalski next to the semicolons for each of those, and then we'll find out who our seconders are. And I see Mike Luisi's hand up. Are you seconding that?
I'm sorry, Tony, I didn't take it down from before.
Okay. No problem. I'm just trying to figure it. Eric Reed, are you seconding that?
Well, okay.
Yes, for the board.
Okay. And Mike Pitney, are you seconding that for the council, or do you have your hand up as for something else?
No, sorry, I didn't take my hand down.
Okay. Joe Semino, are you seconding that for the council?
Yes.
Oh, yes, you can do that on the council. So Maya, for council, you can write Mr. Nowalski and Mr. Semino.
Chris, as co-chair, can I jump in real quickly with a suggested edit to the motion?
Yes, absolutely.
May I suggest in the first sentence that we just be a little more clear, so separation from further development in the Bluefish amendment, since we are talking about a lot of different actions, and yes, we are talking about Bluefish right now, but I think it would just help clarify when we, with all the joint meetings and with all the joint actions that we're considering at the same time right now. If Adam and Eric and Joe are okay with that, that would be my recommendation.
Is that modification acceptable to the maker and the folks who seconded the motion?
Sure, further specification is definitely appropriate here. I think it'll be even more important that we continue with those type of definitions. I suspect this board will need to begin meeting jointly at some point in the time with other boards, so I'll try to keep that in mind in future motions to make sure things stick with the species they're intended for. Thank you.
Eric and Joe, are you okay with that?
Eric is okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I guess well, I'll see if there's any further discussion on this motion. I know we've talked about it a little bit already beforehand, but see if there's anyone else who has any thoughts. And that'll while we do that, Maya can just make that modification to the amendment, just to make it clear this is for Bluefish. So any other comments or discussion by the board and council?
Yeah, Jason McNamee and Tony Delarnia.
Okay, Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll be brief. I'll just state that I will likely support this, but I just want to be clear on the record that that support is because my read of this motion is that this will be put into the recreational reform initiative. So, I'm taking it as some confirmation that it's not just disappearing, that it's going into another venue.
And thanks, Jason. Tony, did you say Tony Delarnia is next in the queue?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. I was going to thought I had my hand up, but no, I support the motion. Let's just let it go at that. Thank you.
And thanks. Any other discussion on the motion?
I do not see any additional hands at this time.
Okay, I'll go ahead and read it into the record. I move to remove recreational for hire sector separation from further development to the Bluefish Amendment. Further development of the for hire sector separations should be considered under comprehensive recreational reform initiatives. We'll try this first. Is there any objection to this motion? If there is, then we'll go ahead and do formal votes.
You're not?
No.
Chris, do we need time for a caucus?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I didn't know. I heard some talking back and forth in the sound, so I wasn't sure if that was people talking to each other. I see a hand up from Emerson. I don't know if he's asking for a caucus or he's objecting.
Emerson?
Both. I don't know if you can hear me.
Okay, great. No worries. I'll go ahead and maybe 2 minutes for the board to caucus, and then we'll call the question.
And Chris, we can do what we did in Striped Bass, where since there, I think, is an objection, we can have the one person from each state raise their hand to vote, and I'll just call off the state, and that way states can hear that I'm counting them to make sure they actually do have their hand raised under the proper category.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. Okay, is any board members or states still need time to caucus, or is everyone ready to call the question?
I don't see any hands asking for more time.
All right, well, so we will start with the Bluefish board, and just FYI, I will not be voting on behalf of North Carolina. Our governor's appointee is unable to join us due to widespread internet outages in the Wilmington area after the hurricane this week. But I'll just choose not to vote on this as a board member. So anyways, so call the question for the board. All those in favor, the designated person for your state, please raise your hand.
And again, I'll read off each state, and if you thought you voted in favor, yes, and I don't read your name, please speak up. We have Delaware, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Maryland, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, Florida, Georgia, NOAA Fisheries, South Carolina, PRFC. Dustin, how many states did I count out?
Hey, Tony, Ellen, I should have my hand up for Virginia.
You do not, just so you know. So, and now you do.
Okay.
Now you do. Now your hand is up. And Virginia. And
So 14.
Say again, Dustin?
That would be a total of 14.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. All those opposed, please raise your hand.
I have New York, and that is all.
Okay, abstentions?
I do not see any abstentions.
Okay, null votes.
I do not see any null votes.
Okay, the motion passes 14 to 1 to 0 to 0. So for the council, I'll turn it over to Mike Louisi.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, for the council, all those, let me ask this. Is there any opposition to the motion?
I don't see any hands, Mike.
Okay, we'll give it another 5 seconds.
Yep.
If you oppose the motion as a member of the council, just please raise your hand and Tony will call that out. And if so, then we'll call a vote. Anything, Tony?
No hands.
Okay, I'll call it a motion then is approved by consensus. So the motion passes both the board and the council. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so Dustin and Matt, I think you got everything you needed for that issue, so we can move on to issue number 7, sector transfers. Whenever you're ready. I know you got to toggle between a couple screens right now. So.
Yeah, this is Dustin. Maya, are you able to pull up the presentation we shared with you? Perhaps it would be easier if another motion comes. Otherwise, I can just take control back.
And Maya, it's slide 47.
Slide 47 with a issue 7 sector transfers displayed on top.
Couple more.
There we go.
There
Thank you.
Thanks, Maya.
Good deal. Thanks. So any comment or feedback from the board and council on this issue?
Mr. Chair, if I may, now that we have removed recreational sector separation, this last row is no longer pertinent, so we can skip that. And really the only feedback we're receiving here is criteria for prohibiting a transfer. Maybe some discussion on what that may be. If the stock is overfished, if overfishing is occurring, or the stock is rebuilding, should we prohibit the use of transfers?
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. Yeah, for kind of focusing in on where you need the feedback the most. So yeah, any feedback or comments from the board and council on criteria for prohibiting a transfer?
I don't have any hands.
Okay, so I guess, Dustin, if no feedback, then is the FMAT able to develop this further? Are you going to need a little more to really do this, or just do all of it? I don't want to leave this meeting without giving the FMAT the guidance that they need.
Yeah, so this is a relatively simple point. So what the FMAT can do is put forward an option that they see as best fit. And when it comes to approve the final range of alternatives for inclusion in a public hearing document or a draft amendment, the board and council can change what the FMAT has decided if they have any more thoughts on this issue later on. So I think we have what we need for now, and we can move on to issue 8.
Okay, thanks. If there, unless any other board or council members have a last minute thought, we'll just move on to issue 8.
I see no hands raised.
So Maya, this would be a similar table with issue 8, commercial state-to-state transfers, refereed approach above it. And apologies for putting you on the spot. It's about maybe 5 or 6 slides down. That's the one, thanks. And as a reminder, the FMAT is recommending removal of this approach.
Okay, thanks. Any comments, feedback on this issue?
We have Nicola Meserve and Jason McNamee and Tony Delernia.
Okay, Nicola?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with the FMAT's recommendation to remove it in its current format as it's been proposed. I think I applaud the FMAT for trying to come up with something that responded to the board's request for a refereed approach, but I think this is really overly complicated and burdensome and won't necessarily improve our current system. I would separately just offer a suggestion to ASMC, I think, to somehow provide some more transparency in when states seek quota transfers. Right now we get a weekly email that says when a transfer has been approved, but that might be too late to a state that's considering asking that same state for a transfer. You may have missed it. So if there could be some consideration given to some way that transfer requests could be made more transparently, then I think that would be a benefit to all the states, whether on the receiving or requesting side. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, can I just put something out there? Is that the commission doesn't approve the transfers for Bluefish. Those get approved by NOAA Fisheries. So we would have to work something out with them in order to help out with that, Nicola.
All right, that makes sense. I guess I just saw the ASMC as the forum where all the states are included. I still think it would be useful for all of us to know more openly when transfers are being requested between. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, that's just a question I asked earlier. What is there any issues different with Bluefish and other quota transfers? But to kind of build on that, this question for Tony Kearns is this something that, at least on the ASMFC side of things, should be discussed in more detail for all of the quota managed species that have quota transfers, instead of just Bluefish? Because I see some common themes. With Bluefish versus Menhaden versus spiny dogfish, et cetera.
Yeah, they're all, most of them are somewhat similar. We get a transfer letter from the receiving and accepting state, and then we approve them. In the past, we have not sent out letters to the board, letting the board know that we've received these letters from the states making requests or receiving. We do it after the transfer has been finalized. So we could send an email out, I guess, prior to finalizing the transfer, but I do believe that we're typically CC'd on transfers for summer flounder and Bluefish, but we are not the finalizer of those transfers, NOAA Fisheries, as we do the transfers for scup and black sea bass, and obviously for other species as well, as you mentioned. So we could come up with a general policy for communication. Perhaps it's something that could get discussed at the executive committee level and then the policy board to finalize an overarching policy. Each plan is a little bit different how it's written in and how the rules are supposed to be followed in terms of the transfers themselves for individual species, though.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think that might be, I don't know, something to think about long term with this issue. Next up is Jay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to also, just because I spoke on it earlier, just kind of acknowledge that I also support removing the refereed approach. It doesn't seem to, I applaud the effort and you know, as someone who is a proponent of doing something here, I didn't offer any great ideas. So I applaud the FMAT for giving it a shot, but also agree with them that this doesn't work. And I also appreciated what Maureen said earlier, and I think that could be a good approach for Bluefish moving forward. If Rhode Island and New York could communicate a bit, I am happy to do so. So just wanted to offer my thoughts on that.
Great, thanks, Jay. Tony Delarney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an unnecessary complication. I would remove it. I agree with what Nicholas said. So long as everyone knows who's transferring what, you're okay. This just complicates things, and I would definitely remove it. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Any objection from any board or council members on removing the refereed approach from this amendment?
I do not see any hands, Mr. Chairman.
All right, great, thanks. So that covers the issues that the FMAT was really looking for feedback from the board and council on. Is there any other issues in the amendment that any board or council members want to address at this point?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, this is Matt.
Yes.
I do believe that we skipped over the rebuilding plan, issue 5. I don't think there's any changes that would be expected here or necessary, but I do think since we're not meeting again until December, that we should maybe pull that up and just see if there are any comments.
Oh, yeah, good catch, thanks.
So Maya, that would be slide 24. You got to scroll up quite a ways, and it's right after the graph with multiple colors. Yeah, so there you go. Thank you, Maya.
Okay, yeah, so as you see on the screen here, the FMAT is requesting further guidance on which alternatives, if any, should be removed for rebuilding plan options. So I'll open up for feedback on that.
So far, I don't have any hands.
Okay. Then yeah, unless anyone objects, then yeah, the FMAT will continue developing all these options for rebuilding.
Adam Nowalski.
Oh, Adam.
Great, thanks. So I know we're not quite done with the Bluefish board, but I just wanted to extend on my further comments earlier that given the decision we made on the for-hire sector separation, that those members of the Bluefish board that are not part of the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass board, I'd like to invite them to the rec reform discussion this afternoon. It's on the agenda for a set time right now. I know we're running a little behind here, so I'm not exactly sure what time that will occur specifically on the agenda. It will occur after lunch. and I will certainly include any members of the Bluefish board that are not members of the Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass board that would like to comment during those discussions. They're invited to do so.
Mr. Chairman,
Great, thanks, Adam.
you have Doug Hamons.
Doug?
Oh, I was just going to make that exact point. Just Adam and I are on the same wavelength. Since South Carolina, Georgia, Florida aren't on that, and I would suggest maybe during that next meeting that we move or attempt to move that recreational amendment out of. Oh, I guess, is there a platform somewhere where the entire commission can be part of it rather than it being within a species board?
I think Adam is if I understood Adam correctly, he's going to allow the states not on the Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass board this afternoon to join in on the conversation over the recreational reform initiative. And Adam, if I misspoke, please let me know. But I think that's the invitation that you're offering to the Bluefish board. Particularly the members who aren't on Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass or on the Mid-Atlantic Council.
So for today, yes, that is my invitation. Leadership has discussed the fact that given previous comments that rec reform may become a more comprehensive species approach beyond just Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass, we are aware of the fact that we're going to need to have discussions about to find the correct venue for rec reform discussions moving forward with the council, whether that's to meet jointly, not just with one of the two boards with the council, but to have the Bluefish board meeting jointly with the Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass board at the same time, or some other mechanism that is on the radar of staff and leadership, both the council and the commission with the board chairs. And we can expect to have more information for commissioners as we move forward. I think what we need to do is, one, have the discussion this afternoon where the possibility is on the table of a formal action being initiated. And then once we have that, I think it will also depend somewhat on where this issue falls with regards to Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass specifically, because for-hire sector separation as part of that amendment will not be taken up this afternoon. That won't be taken up until next week for Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification on that, Adam. So yeah, definitely encourage the folks to my south to listen in this afternoon and participate in that discussion. I think it'll be very pertinent to Bluefish. Is there anything else from the board and council on the Bluefish amendment?
I do not see any additional hands.
Okay, thanks. Matt and Dustin, anything else? Did you get everything you needed for the FMAT to continue developing this?
I think so. Matt?
Yeah, I think we're good. Thanks, Dustin. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
All right, great. Thanks, and thanks again, as always, for walking us through this the issues in this amendment. And it's not an easy task, and the FMAT's been working hard to get to this point, and they have some work ahead. So the last item on the agenda is just a Bluefish board specific item. And that's consider approval of the FMP and state compliance for Bluefish for the 2019 fishing year. I just want to do a time check. Yeah, I know we're running a little behind schedule, but Tony, do we have time to get this completed before we adjourn?
Chris, yeah, I think Dustin, if you could just go to the specific recommendations and skip the rest of the presentation, since most of that will be covered next week during the monitoring committee report, that would be great, just specific to the recommendations.
Yeah, happy to. Tony, are you suggesting that we just put it forward to the board for consensus about taking the PRT recommendations and then doing the FMP review motion separately through email?
Nope, just giving the PRT recommendations and then do the FMP review approval.
Okay.
And this is included in the briefing material, so folks should have had a chance to look at it or can. But anyways, yeah, I'll just hand it over to Dustin so you can go through the PRT recommendation.
Yeah, so I'll try to do a very truncated version of this presentation. Essentially, the PRT found that all states were implemented regulations and monitoring programs that were consistent with the intent of the FMP. And we also had 3 states that requested de minimis status for 2020, Maine, South Carolina, and Georgia. And then in addition to those recommendations for approval of the state compliance reports and state compliance, the PRT also recommends that the board task the TC with reviewing the effectiveness of the Addendum 1 sampling design and reevaluating the optimal geographic range and sample size for Bluefish data. Essentially, by reviewing state-by-state Addendum 1 sampling progress, the PRT noted that it can be especially challenging for some northern states to achieve 50 samples before July, considering that Bluefish may only begin to become available in June. The PRT thought that this would be helpful to reconsider the seasonal requirements for samples based on updated recreational data. And so in addition to this, the PRT also recommends that the TC look into the increased importance of recreational discards in stock assessments, and noted that generating reliable discard length data from recreational anglers could improve the robustness of stock assessments moving forward. So that's a very quick and dirty version of what I was going to present, but essentially we have the PRT recommendation for approval of the FMP review, state compliance reports, and de minimis requests from Maine, South Carolina, and Georgia's commercial fisheries, as well as the PRT recommendations listed here.
Okay, thanks, Dustin. Appreciate you getting through that very, very quickly, but I think you covered everything the most important thing. So any questions for Dustin on the FMP review?
And Mr. Chairman, I think we could do approval of the document and the de minimis requests. And if the board is interested in having the TC look into these items, then we could just do all of that by consensus.
So instead of a formal motion, just see if just by consensus if the board approves the FMP review and the tasks the PRT is recommending the TC do.
Correct. And I see Nicola with her hand up.
Nicola?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I definitely agree with these recommendations from the PRT. The second one really gets to the discussion that we've been having a lot lately when we talk about should we use the GARFO method or the MRIP method for doing the discard estimates in the recreational fishery, and it's pointed to the fact that we really need some additional discard length data. So that one's really key. But so I support those recommendations, and additionally I would move to accept the FMP review and approve the de minimis requests from Maine, South Carolina, and Georgia.
All right, thanks, Nicholas. So yeah, we have a motion will be up on the board here soon to approve the FMP review and de minimis status for those states. So get that up on the screen.
And Justin Davis is seconding that.
All right, great. So I put the maker of the motion and seconder up here. So move to approve the PRT recommendations, the Bluefish Fishery Management Plan review of the 2019 fishing year, state compliance reports, and de minimis requests for Maine, South Carolina, and Georgia's commercial fisheries.
I don't
Any
see
objection?
any. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I thought I was on mute, but I guess not. So no objections?
No, I don't see any hands.
All right, great. So that's approved, and yeah, look forward to the work by the technical committee, especially looking at ways to collect more lengths on released recreational bluefish. So last thing on the agenda is any other business. So does any board or council members have any other business to discuss for today's meeting?
I don't see any additional hands.
All right, great. So unless there's any objection, the Bluefish board meeting, along with the council, is adjourned. I'll hand it over. I'll pass it over to Mike Luisi if he has any other comments, but otherwise I think we stand adjourned.
No, thanks, Chris. No, nothing at this time.